Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Michael Copeland, and we are here with Benedict Evans back from London. And you were well outside of the Apple reality distortion field for the watch event yesterday. So we want to talk about that and get your impression. So Benedict, welcome.
Thank you. So it's interesting. Everything Apple does is interesting in a sense. And it's interesting to list all of the different rules that they're breaking or challenging, or all the things that they're doing in different ways. I think the first thing that caught everyone's attention, and of course this was a thing that there was a lot of speculation about beforehand, was the price of the gold version of the Apple Watch. Which, 6 months ago when they said there would be a gold one, people thought, aha, when the price of that comes out, people are going to lose their minds. And a lot of people did. So it's $10,000, and it goes up to, I think, $17,000 or something.
Right, for all the extra fancy bits.
For all the extra fancy bands. And so you've got a bunch of people talking about this as though they are unaware of the existence of the luxury goods business, where people buy $10,000 dresses that you only wear once, and
right.
They buy $500,000 watches and buy lots of them, and pay $20,000 for a transatlantic first class plane ticket or transcontinental plane ticket. And so there's a discussion to be had around, will people who buy $10,000 mechanical watches buy a $10,000 electronic watch? Do they expect it? Do they buy those watches expecting that they'll last? Are they willing to replace it? I don't think you can extrapolate too much from the way existing markets work when you kind of drop a new product into it. I think what you can say about the gold watch is, well, Switzerland, I think, sells about 500,000 precious metal watches a year. And Apple is sort of selling into that market, sort of not, but it's kind of selling into that market. They may sell a lot, they may not sell many. But either way, it's kind of a drop in the ocean for Apple. Even if they sell 100,000 gold watches, it's kind of, well, so what? Right. I think what's much more interesting, really, for the gold watch is the effect it has overall on the position of the watch in the market.
So that's what I want to ask you, why do it? We don't, in the Apple lineup, you can't buy a $20,000, iPad if you wanted to, but you can certainly buy this.
Well, count
the
rules that you're breaking and not breaking. So gold watches are a thing. Gold computers are not a thing. And It's a gold watch. And gold watches are expensive because there's gold in them. Why has Apple decided to do this? You could argue it's because they've lost their mind, or it's a vanity project, or because they can. I think what's more interesting is to compare it with the Apple retail business, which, until they stopped disclosing it, was about 10% of Apple revenue. So they weren't selling stuff through the retail stores particularly. Most of the stuff was being sold through other channels. But what retail did was it created this totally unique perception and this totally unique way of selling product, way of demonstrating product, and of course providing customer service. And so Apple retail really was a self-funding marketing operation.
Right.
It was an enormous billboard on the most prestigious shopping street of every city in the developed world. And nobody else had stores that big selling that kind of product in those kinds of places. No luxury goods store. No one who sold things as expensive as Apple's products even then had those stores that big. And nobody who had stores that big had them in those kinds of places. And so they broke all the rules of retail. And then you look at the watch and you think, okay, how does that change how people look at the $500 or the $1,000 watch? How difficult is it for Samsung to copy that? It's impossible, effectively, for Samsung to copy that. You can argue about Apple's ability to sell a $10,000 watch. I don't think anybody would argue about Samsung's ability to sell a $10,000 watch.
Right.
I don't think anybody would even think for a moment that Samsung could do that. And so I think there's a brand halo effect here. And I think that said, one can kind of put this in a box and put it to one side, because there is a much broader argument, which is the watch. Yes, there is a $10,000 one. Yes, they might sell $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, 50,000 of them in a year. So what? Fine. Now let's talk about the actual watch.
Right. What did we learn?
And what do we learn?
If anything?
So we didn't learn that much that was actually new. We've got a whole bunch of third-party apps, some of which are very appealing. And we got the pricing of the mainstream models, which go up to about $1,000. And frankly, $1,000 for a polished stainless steel watch with a woven metal bracelet or a high-quality leather bracelet is perfectly normal, perfectly par for the course for that kind of product. In fact, it's probably better quality than what you get if you went to one of the existing manufacturers. And I think the big question really hasn't changed from 6 months ago when they first showed it to us, which is, and I kind of broke this into two parts, or perhaps three parts. The first is, it reminded me of the iPad. You looked at the iPad when it was launched, and clearly, if you wanted to buy a lightweight 9-inch touchscreen computer, this was the one to get. But it wasn't actually clear if that was a good idea in the first place. And by extension, then, I was also reminded of mobile phones, that if we'd been sitting here 20 years ago, you'd look at a mobile phone and say, well, yeah, they're kind of lightweight now, and they're kind of cheap, and they'll probably get lighter and cheaper, but am I ever actually going to want to own one, regardless of how light and how cheap it gets? And it wasn't, most people 20 years ago would have said probably not, actually. Back in 1995, most people didn't think they'd ever have a mobile phone. I certainly didn't. I certainly thought I'd never have a mobile phone. And how do you fit this new thing into your life? How does your life change around it? Why is it useful? And it's not useful in the way that a mobile phone is, even in the way that... So we looked at a mobile phone and you said, well, I've already got a telephone.
Right.
And it turned out that having a telephone when you're walking down the street in some random place was actually completely different from having one at home or having a payphone. And it was actually really a different product than a landline. And so is a watch a different thing? Well, it's in your wrist and your smartphone is in your pocket, and you need both. And you will continue to need both for the time being because of things like battery life and space. You can't put a cellular radio and a battery that can power it into something that will fit on your wrist. At least not yet.
Battery, but just backing up for a second, battery life, they're saying, is in the neighborhood of...
Yeah, it depends how you use it.
Right.
You get the thing and all of your friends say, whoa, that's cool, show it to me. The battery will be dead in 3 or 4 hours.
Right.
If you actually use it in like a kind of a normal use, it looks like you'll get all day out of it quite reliably.
Okay.
We'll see.
Right.
We'll see. So, but the deeper... And of course, the reason why you need your phone is to preserve battery life, because all the heavy lifting is done on your phone, not on the device. So the question is, okay, what does it mean to have this extra screen, this other screen on your wrist? You could argue that this means, well, you'll just be swamped by even more information. You could argue that it's a filter, that instead of pulling your phone out of your pocket every 10 minutes and reading all of your Twitter feed and looking at all of your emails, you glance at your wrist every 10 minutes and do I have an important email? Do I have a Twitter mention? Do I have something that I need to see? If not, if so, I take my phone out or I read it. If not, carry on doing what I was doing. So you could argue it kind of preserves you from information overload in some senses. And then, of course, there's the thing, it reminds me, of course, of Google Glass. Again, Google Glass didn't do anything that you couldn't do with a smartphone, but, it kind of tried to do it in a different way. And so does the watch, but without all the kind of the glass hole problems of the sort of imposing the screen between you and other people. I think there's a lot of psychology and a lot of user behavior and a lot of perception around this, as opposed to pure utility. And I think that's the most, fundamentally the most interesting thing about this is that, Apple is doing trying to do a step change in usability and in the emphasis of the product. That's to say, when you went with the Mac, you had a step change in usability, a step change in how you thought about the product. Again, with the iPhone, again, partially at least with the iPad, certainly as compared to a PC or Mac. And then the watch, again, it's another step in abstraction, and it's another step in the importance of delight over feeds and speeds. So,
but that sounds to me like you are starting to sort of zero in a little bit on those use cases that you're still wondering what it's going to be used for,
well,
or at least like the types.
So I think there's a fine point in here around there are these specific things that you do with it, but then an awful lot of people buy watches. I don't happen to own a watch, just as I don't own a $10,000 watch. But lots of people do. And why do you buy a $10,000 watch instead of a $100 watch? And no, it's not so other people see it, incidentally. That's a really idiotic analysis. Why are we not sitting here wearing boiler suits? Why have we chosen clothes that we like?
I actually am wearing a boiler suit.
Yes, but it's an ironic boiler suit.
Yes.
It's an ironic Berkeley boiler suit.
Yes, exactly.
If we only bought things that had very specific utilitarian use cases, we would all live in a capsule hotel and we would all drive the same car and we would all wear the same clothes. We would be living in North Korea, in effect. And we don't. And I think the progression of the technology industry, one of the ways I described this as sort of technology outgrowing tech, is that it moves from selling technology products to selling things that fill other desires or kind of other pleasures. I think this company we've invested in, Ringly, is very interesting in this sense. It produces a piece of costume jewelry with a notification light that tells you if your boyfriend's phoned or if you've had a like on Instagram or something that you can customize. Yes, you could put your smartphone out, but it's actually quite nice to do it in this other way. Yes, I could just wear a boiler suit, but I do kind of like spending $500 on that beautiful jacket that I'm going to wear every now and then, or, spending $1,000 on a light instead of going to IKEA and buying a $10 light. And it's not stupid to do that any more than it's stupid to buy the $10 light. You move up Maslow's pyramid and you think about different things and you value different things. And so I think where Apple is kind of pushing with the watch is in that sense that delight, for want of a better term, is more important than the feeds and speeds. It's worth noting, incidentally, that with the iPhone, they don't tell you what the clock speed is on the chip. I mean, they do talk a lot about the chip, but they don't tell you the clock speed. They don't tell you they don't give you numbers for the clock speed and the RAM and everything else. So all they tell you really, the only spec they tell you is the storage.
Right.
And the same thing for the iPad. And then you go to the watch, they don't tell you anything yet. I mean, if you dig around enough, you can find out what kind of Wi-Fi it's got if you really care. But they don't tell you what the clock speed of the CPU is. I think apparently it has 8 gig of storage, but you're not really supposed to care about that either. And so the technology fades more and more into the background as an enabler for other experiences that are not about how fast you run this program. Rather, it is about you lift your wrist and you tap on Uber and you press yes, and then you drop your wrist. Rather than pulling the phone out and loading the app and doing this and doing that and pressing wait. It's about friction and pleasure and enjoyment as opposed to operating the user interaction model, operating the user interface for a computer program.
It's interesting because, what you describe, Apple has done this amazing job of creating these objects of desire in the end. Like, we all wanted an iPhone, we all wanted an iPod when they came out. But they've sort of bolstered the reason why you want it with all these speeds and feeds, et cetera, like you say, and all the utility. Now they've created this object of desire and maybe it's the first sort of instantiation of like this pure Apple object of desire from the get-go.
I think that's right. I mean, the progression that you see, particularly with the iPad and the iPhone, even more than the iPhone, was that it's a piece of glass that can be anything. And so it is pure. An iPad, in effect, is pure software.
Right.
It's not about, you can't change the ports, there's no USB socket, there's no SD card. You're not supposed to think about that at all. It's supposed to be literally just a piece of glass, a sealed piece of glass that can be anything when it lights up. And the watch, I think, is the same, but it's just taking that much further. It is just a piece of glass. Now, these are the things that piece of glass can become. But it doesn't have to have a micro USB port on it or an SD card slot on the thing.
Right.
Or even necessarily a camera, although, a camera might come. I mean, who knows, maybe not. But it is about a little magic piece of glass that can be anything. And primarily what that little magic piece of glass is supposed to do is be pleasing and be delightful and be an enjoyable thing to own. And the world is full of enjoyable, delightful, pleasing things to own that you don't need. Go into any, home store or lifestyle store and look at all the things that you could spend money on that you don't need, but people like.
So I'm looking at you right now, and you have an iPhone 6 in front of you and an iPad, and I see you carry around a laptop. But like you said, you do not wear watches. You're an inveterate non-watch wearer. Do you think you're going to start wearing a watch? Or this watch, I should say.
Well, if I wasn't sort of professionally obligated to try it out for a while, you mean? I don't know. It is a pleasing thing in a way that the existing smartwatches do not appeal to me as an object. There are, at the same time, there are $1,000 mechanical watches that I've sort of looked at for the last 2 or 3 years and thought, well, I might get one, I might not, maybe. I'm not sure. I'll think about it. Would I buy one of these if I wasn't, again, sort of professionally obliged to get it? I don't know, but I also don't think that's really the point, because what you're also seeing is this kind of expansion into areas where it's not something that everyone will have. It's just a delightful, pleasing product,
right,
that many people will have.
Right. Well, it launches, at least in the U.S., April 24th?
End of April.
End of April. So we'll start seeing them in the wild. And Benedict, I will start checking your wrists around the end of April, too. And we'll talk more about what you're using it for and what you're seeing in it and whether you like it.
Sure.
Thanks, Benedict.
Thanks.